Good morning and welcome to Grand Rounds at the UCSF Osher Center for Integrative Health. My name is Selena Chan and I am the Associate Director of Clinical Programs. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session and introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Nicole Redvers. Dr. Redvers earned her doctorate in naturopathic medicine from the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine and her Master's of Public Health from Dartmouth College. She is a member of the Deninu K'ue First Nation and has dedicated her career to working with Indigenous patients, scholars, and communities around the world. Dr. Redvers is Associate Professor, Research Chair, and Director of Indigenous Planetary Health at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University. She is an internationally recognized voice in integrating Indigenous perspectives into human and planetary health research and clinical practice. She is the author of the book, The Science of the Sacred, Bridging Global Indigenous Medicine Systems and Modern Scientific Principles. After Dr. Redvers' presentation, we will have 15 minutes for discussion. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature at any point during the presentation. Lastly, I'd like to express my holistic gratitude to our Grand Rounds planning team, including Dr. Shelley Adler, Patty Moran, as well as Yvette Coulter, Anita Botello-Santoyo, and Julia Burns. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Redvers. Welcome, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, all. Really appreciate the warm introduction. And just bear with me. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. Get the technology up. All right, perfect. So I'm going to make the assumption that you can see the screen okay, and that you can hear me okay as well. So Donatea, as noted, Nicole Redvers, member of the Deninu K'ue First Nation. And it's really important coming to any space like this to ensure, as an Indigenous person, we root ourselves within our relationality. And positionality, generally reflexivity, if, in some research centers could be said as an academic orientation, but in this case, it's a form of relational responsibility. Because as a clinician, as a researcher, I'm as a Deninu K'ue First Nation member, need to be in relation to my work, to my culture, to my community, and this location in a purposeful way is really in order to demonstrate not only respect for, but also accountability to Salotina, or all my relations, as we say in my Denisutline language. So Deninu K'ue First Nation is located up in the subarctic region of Canada. So if you were to draw a line pretty much straight east from Alaska, that's where my home region is, in the land's called Denedeh, known as Land of the People in the Northwest Territories. Now, we don't benefit, however, from those nice ocean currents in Alaska. So although there are some places in the Midlands where we're fairly cold and right now fairly ice-covered place, although I will say where I am right now, which is situated on the traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, the Chonatan and Lenape peoples here in the southwestern part of Ontario, about halfway from Detroit and Toronto, that it is also very snowy here as well for the first time, so it's feeling a little bit more like home. Hope everyone's doing well today, and really excited for the discussion, perhaps taking a little bit of a different format comparatively to other kinds of presentations, which is purposeful in and of itself. Because it's really important to note that from my Indigenous way of being, my way of knowing, and also my lived experience, it's really been informed by tens of thousands of years of memories that are stored in my region's stories. And stories are really our main method, if we could say, rooted directly in the lands that we come from. And I really like how George Kajati aptly states this relationship, an American Indian scholar from the Southwest. The culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals being in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I must always honor my elders, past, present, future, culture is anything that I share or talk about from my Indigenous way of being is not my knowledge, not something I can claim as my expertise, but instead the collective knowing of a group of people that, as noted previously, stretches thousands of years of memories within my region. Now, our Indigenous clinical methodologies, if we could say, for health and well-being, really are rooted within a decolonized state of being that is premised on what we could say is 4 Rs, which is respect, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, and increasingly platformed around also rematriation and in some cases resistance, with direct underpinnings and transferability to our kinship relationships that we have with many planetary elements and beings stretching from the very small or the micro all the way to the meta levels of existence. Now, this idea of how we formulate our relationships are really rooted in a framework of knowing that prizes interconnectedness or the understanding of interconnectedness as a fundamental base. So if we think about how to turn this interconnected relationship specifically to land, and in this case, land with a capital L, noting our relationship to it as opposed to just a mere geographic place, how do we turn this interconnected relationship to land into a methodology for health and well-being? And of course, we've always had a methodology. There's been a healing method in existence for thousands of years and how to live and heal sustainably. And all are based on what we might call sacred natural laws, sometimes called first laws or original laws, sometimes called original instructions. In my region, we call them Dene laws because we're Dene peoples. And these natural laws define our traditional protocols, or the guidelines or rules set out within life to ensure the balance of not only ourselves, but our communities as well as the planets. So these sacred natural laws, which define our traditional protocols, give a framework for the modern world scholarship, healing, and even things like governance. Now, these sacred laws are traditional protocols or guidelines, and therefore frameworks for healing, are all done through the respect of ceremony, with ceremony being a critical action in reciprocity, the action of feeling gratitude is part of ceremony, the action of breathing, of walking in the world is a form of ceremony. So, why does this matter? And I think, as we can all appreciate, the world has changed, and perhaps even changing at a faster pace over the last number of years. We've really went from this circular and natural worldview to a very square and synthetic worldview. And I often will ask folks to take a moment to look at this image and just see how it makes your body feel when you really attune to the energy that's within it. So how do we get back to our origin? How do we foundation ourselves and teach others the natural laws and protocols that allow for a more sustainable world? Because the health effects are clear that land to us is not just a healing place because of what it provides us, what it gives us in resources, but what it gives us in relationship. Now, the lens of the world, how we see the world, clearly affects how we see our innate hierarchy of ourselves over all other beings on the planet. This ego, this I, human-centric sort of approach, which has permeated most of our considerations, particularly when we work in human medicine. Comparatively to this eco-we, cosmocentric, or this ecocentric approach, where humans are just seen to be one very small part of a larger ecosystem. So health equity in general, with this consideration of health equity, are becoming more common in modern discourse, although we've seen some changes over the last few years, particularly around policy and pushback around what equity actually means. But what's important, as denoted here, is really an interspecies equity approach that is seen from a place of relationship or relationality, because we are all interconnected with no hierarchy between us when it comes to how the natural systems operate in the world. You can have power, you can have money, but it does not change the interconnected reality of our hierarchy and what it actually means in the context of our natural systems operate. The moons will continue to rise in a certain aspects that will affect the tides. The sun will continue to rise from the east and set in the west, but Mother Earth will also respond to our interactions with her, which ultimately affects all life forms. So this interconnected nature, also depicted here by this figure, shows us that we're unified communities due to this interconnectedness on all fields of structure and influence. Yet, of course, as noted, there's clear interrelationships with repercussions for not living in balance with the planet. Because we have something called Earth-centered jurisprudence systems from Indigenous communities. And these Earth-centered jurisprudence or natural law systems govern both nature and global systems. There is a unity of natural laws between us and the Earth. As noted, we cannot change where the sun rises. We cannot change where the moon goes. These are absolute fundamental realities that we are bound by. So when it comes to the vision for a healthy future, it's important to create the conditions that enable the overcoming of this ongoing dissonance between this idea of being in nature, nature that surrounds us. We're going out into a park, comparatively to being of nature, a nature that embodies us, that we're interconnected by. And one of the ways that I often depict this to folks is, if we remember back to high school biology and our percent body, or the percent of our body that's made up of water. And, we could say maybe an average of 70% or so, depending on if you're born male or born female. And then if we could give an average of about how often our cells turn over in our body, and many of us know, of course, certain cells turn over much more quickly, like our gastric tracts, around 4 to 6 weeks, comparatively to our bones, which turn over much more slowly. But if we could just give an average of the whole body, let's say cellular turnover every 3 months or so, we become renewed. We become new. And then I often ask folks, which I always find the most interesting answers from kids, although I'm always surprised how little adults also know, is where does your water come from that comes out of your tap? Where does it come from? And sometimes about 25% of the room knows where that is, sometimes a little bit more. So where I am here right now, there's one big large pipe that comes from both Lake Huron and Lake Erie, two of the Great Lakes. So if I've been in this place, London, Ontario, for about 3 months, I'm sitting here behind this screen is about 60 to 70% Lake Huron and Lake Erie. Just like every single one of you are sitting behind your screens, a 60 to 70% of the water body that comes out of your tap, the lakes and rivers that are around you. We are in and of itself nature, not separated by it. If the water is healthy, we can be healthy. If the water is not healthy, we can't be healthy. So these metaphoric symbolisms of interconnectedness is only one part, because our interconnectedness is also a physiological reality. Creating this reconnection between folks and their environments is critical to remembering who we are as human beings, as people on this earth. So in thinking about this idea of connectedness to planet, many of our Indigenous medicine systems have clear understandings about the notion of connecting patients and planet as part of our prescribing, part of our advice giving, part of our guidance. So I termed this concept to be able to better elucidate this within non-Indigenous communities, patient planetary health co-benefit prescribing, which is a mouthful, but essentially it's an overarching terminology to denote any prescribing practice or clinical advice given that explicitly takes into account both the patient's and the planet's health in the action of prescribing. And in some ways, we have medicines in our community that if we don't pick them, they will not grow. They need the attention of humans. Whereas if we overpick them, they also will not grow because they're overpicked. They need the balance between the human touch, but also the sustainability actions and choices that know where we need to be. The plant teaches us balance in essence. So when an Indigenous knowledge holder or a traditional Indigenous medicine person is thinking about a prescription, if we could say more in the Western term, the environment is not separated from that consideration. The timing of the year, as we know, but also the sustainability of the plant, but also the energy of what that means for the health of the environment and the health of the plant. So this idea of co-benefit approaches really considers how some changes or impacts to the environment, whether or not it's climate change or biodiversity impacts, can also advance other policy goals while leading to improvements in health overall. So in our communities, we've increasingly seen terminology to encompass our health system way or our way of approaching health, which is really around the concept of land. Now, land, of course, in ocean settings, whether or not you're in Pacific Islands or otherwise, might encompass something different like water. But what's really important is that when we say land from this sense, it's really an all-encompassing term in Indigenous approaches to learning, to being, which includes all aspects of the natural world, including plants, animals, ancestors, spirits, natural features in the environment, air, water, earth, and minerals. It's not just the soil between our feet. And we capitalize the term to capture the deeper cultural meaning and the relationality to the word. And when not capitalized, using it more in terms of its physical location or the geographical concept of land. When we say land-based, the land is a feature or concept rooted in our Indigenous ways of knowing. On the land, used as a reference to the location away from established community centers, although increasing, we're starting to see on the land capabilities within urban places, with renewed thinking about what this concept could mean, particularly in marginalized populations that have a hard time accessing land bases. And then, of course, healing in terms of our aspects overall. When we think about combining these terminologies, we come up with this concept called land-based health or land-based healing, land-based programs. And this term is used to designate a formal or informal health or healing practice program or service that takes place, I would say now, both in an urban and non-urban, rural or remote location on a land base that has been intentionally spiritually cultivated to ensure the land is honored and respected. With the land being situated firmly in Indigenous pedagogy is understood to be an active host and a partner to the person or people engaged in the healing process. We're not just stepping onto land and experiencing it. The land is seen to be an active host, an active healer, an active partner in the person or people engaged in the healing process, as long as that land-based has been intentionally spiritually cultivated to ensure the land is honored and respected. And that is deeply connecting when that is able to occur. And you'll see that as a part of many of our Indigenous ceremonies that occur, whether or not it's things like powwow or Sundance or some of the other kinds of ceremonies that happen on a familial basis within community. So there's many kinds of land-based initiatives, including the development and implementation of various forms of programs and activities, whether or not it is traditional healing or treatment and wellness camps, land-based educational programs, incorporating both Euro-Western science and traditional knowledge, recreation, of course, and variations of these different modalities combined. But one aspect of these programs is that they're, of course, physically operated in natural landscapes located a distance away from communities, although, again, we're seeing more urban sites around this. And these on the land or land-based initiatives are really part of an understanding of that reciprocal and fundamental relationship we have with our natural environment, seeing that land as an active host within the process. Now, many of these programs are very different from wilderness or nature-based programs based on the Indigenous philosophy and ideology that underlies them. It's that spiritual connectivity that comes from an Indigenous way of knowing that very much separates out these land-based kinds of programs from other kinds of also very beneficial nature-based programs that are out there. However, one of the elders in a project a number of years ago stated very clearly, the Indigenous experts interviewed in this research reminded me that land connection is something that speaks to all of us as people of Mother Earth. We all have this capability of being connected to nature, especially given the example that I noted before about the water and how we are all sitting here as 60 to 70% of the rivers and waters of where we come from. We are embodied natural beings, and that reconnection force becomes very powerful. So a number of years ago, we up in the Canadian subarctic created the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation for the purposes of formalizing an urban land-based healing camp, noting that for a lot of people, particularly in increasingly dense urban settings, have a more difficult time being able to access these kinds of land-based support programs. So we actually found a small land-based within an urban center in a city in the region, and really took note of the process and and protocol of bringing elders in the region together with formal planning to determine the programmatic goals of the project. And of course, elders ensuring the traditional protocols of the region were followed, depending on the land base of where we're at. We always want to ensure local protocols followed, with the overarching goal of the camp was to combine Indigenous cultural education with traditional Indigenous therapeutic interventions in a wilderness urban setting to favorably impact the health and wellness of, particularly at that point, marginalized Indigenous communities. It was, of course, located in the city of Limit, still is today, accessible to the public and built from the ground up with traditional structures such as canvas bush tents, teepee, and an Inuit traditional tent. I will say it was not easy putting up an 8-year-long camp in the context of a city, but we were able to work with city officials to ensure that that was possible. And these structures were very purposely built, not only to ensure cultural representation of all Indigenous peoples within the locale, but also to ensure the land atmosphere permeated the experience of visitors, taking into account the sights, the smells, the sounds, the textures of that space, and being purposeful again about spiritually cultivating that space as a land-based site. So in terms of how land-based healing, how we think about it is very much from the micro to the small. It's parts of our component, this idea of microbial or even molecular decolonization, bringing ourselves back to this nature place, all the way up to this meta understanding of how we interconnect with the world, the philosophies that are embedded naturally within that. And these contexts matter because oftentimes we focus on the protocols. What do we do for A, B, and C? How do we treat A, B, and C without forgetting about the situational context that we exist in and how ourselves are connected to all of these fundamental levels for true balance, at least as how we see it within our Indigenous communities. So if we think about then, what we can learn from Indigenous health systems overall, a lot of these things are being increasingly appreciated, particularly around some of the other kinds of traditional medicine systems, integrative medicine systems as well, where we understand that the world is complex. However, we can participate in this dynamic nature of reality to affect change within ourselves and other systems. The relationships, of course, are most of focus comparatively to the variables alone. We increasingly get stuck to variables, particularly as we advance, which is important science-based narratives, but sometimes at the extent of forgetting about the importance of the relationships. An individual is always situated within the context of the community and the planet. How do we bring in these patient planetary health considerations into our purview in day-to-day practice? There's multi-layered accountability mechanisms that span multiple scales of influence, and they're always in place, whether we are aware of them or not. This goes back to that earth-centered jurisprudence systems of how natural systems are governed the same way our bodies are. Whether or not this is seen to be an individual, collective, planetary, and for our Indigenous communities, much connected to our spirituality. And holism is not merely understood as mental, emotional, physical, spiritual dimensions of health, but also upwards of the community interactions, our complexity within our communities, and specifically to our planetary levels as well. I wanted to bring in briefly this concept of cultural safety because I think it is really important to consider as a part of the practice of care, not only for Indigenous communities, but for many communities. Although this concept did primarily come out of Indigenous communities, specifically Maori nurses in Aotearoa or New Zealand. And cultural safety has varying interpretations within and between countries, but it really foregrounds the power differentials within society and the requirement for health professionals to reflect on our own interpersonal power differences, their own and that of the patient, and how the transfer of power within multiple contexts can facilitate appropriate care for Indigenous people and arguably for all. And we've seen a lot of dialogue, particularly out of certain institutions, with studying these power differentials and mechanisms to be able to how to think about this, but particularly when it comes to intercultural contexts with Indigenous peoples. Because one of the key components, of course, is that cultural competency often focuses on checkbox approaches that if we learn about folks' culture, that automatically, we're going to be better providers. The research has said time and time again that that's not the case. In fact, sometimes only acknowledging the cultural practices can be at the detriment of patient care, where we actually really need to see the hierarchy of knowledge and participation of decision making that comes, particularly given the fact that in Indigenous communities, our knowledge keepers, our traditional medicine people never see themselves as being higher experts or with greater knowledge comparatively to the rest of the community. We all come with gifts to the circle, and how to be able to participate that to get somebody well is really a key purpose of that. Now, medical pluralism itself is another concept that refers to the coexistence of differing medical traditions, and this crowd, of course, knows that very well. But what's sometimes different is that when it comes to medical pluralism of Indigenous communities, we're really not only talking about different kinds of medicine traditions, but very divergent epistemological positions, ontological positions, which is basically saying how we differ and how we see ourselves as beings, but also how we interpret knowledge within the world. And it's commonly embodied by Indigenous people, this necessary practice of medical pluralism, particularly in today's day and age. And we see concepts like two-eyed seeing, where one eye is used with Indigenous views, the other eyes with Euro-Western views to be able to look at solutions or even challenges with the gift of multiple perspectives, bringing in this embodiment of all two-eyed seeing, multiple views, this braiding of knowledges kinds of approach when it comes to thinking about the practice of medicine. Now, in the Western way, we've seen a lot of operationalization of cultural safety through things like shared medical decision. And in fact, in my mind, shared medical decision becomes a necessary tool to be able to enact or action cultural safety in practice, because it provides this helpful framework for applying the ethical obligations of clinicians, but also really focus on equalizing power between patients and healthcare providers to provide more equitable healthcare. Number of institutions that are doing a lot of good decision-making tools around that, including around the Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy, but also a number of other institutions as well. And in my mind, really adapted to the cultural context if that lens is brought in. But I really wanted to highlight that within this broad scope of considering Indigenous peoples, Indigenous traditional medicine, each nation really has their own belief system, ceremonies, practices, and traditional medicines they may use. There's 575 federally recognized tribes in the United States, not including state-recognized tribes and not including non-recognized tribes. Here in Canada, we have 630 plus First Nations, 4 unique Inuit populations, as well as multiple Métis community. And that's within North America alone. So we can just imagine across the world the diversity of cultural practices. And it's why concepts like cultural safety, shared decision-making become really good tools to be able to engage, to bridge, to partner with other medicine systems in a respectful way, not only for working with patients and providers, but also working professional to professional, if we could say. Now, why is this important in terms of practice, particularly in places like the United States, where we see some of the health inequities in Indigenous populations in the United States being equivalent to that of people in Haiti? Despite, of course, a complete lack of health service system availability within countries like that, we have absolutely pervasive health equities within our tribal communities. And the health of Indigenous peoples matters not only for themselves, of course, for flourishing communities, individuals, participants within their own self-determination and survival in their communities, but it also really matters for the health of the planet as well, because we've seen very clearly overall that when Indigenous peoples have their culture, when they have their knowledge, when they have their self-determination, when they have their land rights, they're able to continue to be able to steward 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet, 1/3 of the remaining old growth forests, as well as some of the most biodiverse regions on the planet. These are key aspects that we know are occurring. However, that the more pressures, structural disadvantage, as well as health inequities are put on Indigenous peoples, it makes it much more difficult for them to continue their stewardship responsibilities for the health of people, communities, and the planet, not only for themselves, but really for all. So, in our clinical practice, in the systems we contribute to, how can we think about going from one way of knowing to ecologies of knowledge, hierarchical practices to communities of practice, disconnection to reconnection, fear to wonder and awe, universities to pluriversities, anthropocentric to ecocentric, despair to hope, domination to participation, hegemony to inclusivity, me to we, knowledge transmission to relational care? Because the reality is that we cannot solve complex problems from the same worldview that created them in the first place, as it will continue to perpetuate a disconnect between us as peoples, as communities, and the planet as relatives. Again, we cannot solve complex problems from the same worldview that created them in the first place, as it will continue to perpetuate a disconnect between us as individuals and communities, as well as between the planet as relatives. Now, our elders remind us that land-based is one of those words. It's a beautiful, wonderful term. It's bringing people back to the land and helping them become alive and remembering their humanity and their connection to all living things. We are the land, so if we remember who we are, then the same miracle that we see all around us will be us. This concept, in some ways is relevant no matter the populations that we come from. Having practiced and been in North Dakota for a while, some of the people that were the most close to the land, which we often think of being politically divergent, are actually farmers. And farmers love their land and oftentimes have deep connection to it. So, these assumptions I think we have about populations and the context of what this means, how this works within the realities of people's own lives is really important to connect to that health and well-being aspect overall. So I would love to see, land-based healing camps across the nation, across the world. Remembering our interconnection with nature will be one of the most fundamental and important things to move us through the ongoing crisis we face as a society, because it is remembering our humanity. It's not about the earth and land per se. It's about ourselves, because we are in and of itself nature. And having that haven within ourselves is one of the most special things about a human being. So I want to just sort of end with maybe a little bit of a meditation in some ways, or a storyline that connects a little bit some of the concepts that we talk about, almost like a pechakuka, if we could say, to wrap us up. And one of the things I think as part of our narratives within Indigenous communities is we often get stuck within our heads a lot in modern society, and being able to think about ourselves in a different way is fundamentally important, particularly in a world of chaos, as we see increasingly being the case right now in day-to-day life. So with that, a breath. When mother trees are dying, they send messages of wisdom onto the next generation of seedlings. She sends these messages through a vast internet-like fungal network in the soil to her neighboring seedlings. This increases the resistance of these seedlings to future stretches, which in essence means that trees talk. Like trees, humans have evolved into a network of interdependence that spans the rocks, the plants, the animals, and the air that we breathe. Many have forgotten or are unaware of how, or that the ability exists to communicate on the subtlest levels to the living and non-living entities that have surrounded us for thousands of years. If we take the knowledge of basic physics to point, we can clearly see that there is no real difference between a person, the food they eat, and their environment, particularly if going to the indivisible fundamental particle level, of which is essentially nothing. Great sages and healers were said to come out of deep meditative states with the realization that all we are is a thought. Consciousness or awareness is not only in the clouds or in some designated point of space, it's right behind the darkness that we perceive with our closed eyes. Many Indigenous cultures cannot separate their bodies and health from the environment around them. Every ceremony, dance, prayer, and song is done to connect with this underlying fundamental energy force with the universe that can be heard, felt, and seen when it's the state of mind that transcends the physicality of the body. This adaptation and awareness of the smallest particle level of existence is profound, as by definition, if a fundamental particle cannot be broken down any further, it means there's nothing physical about it in the first place. We are spiritual beings. Our lives may only appear to exist engendered as holographic images on a two-dimensional field that tricks our sense of physicality into a realm that brings more mystery than answers. Ask any trailblazing research physicist. You cannot understand true medicine power in whatever capacity that may be unless you have an understanding of the nature of things. To understand the nature of things, you need to be in nature. You need to connect to the animals, the rocks, the plants, the stars, and the winds. Land as medicine is not necessarily a physical description of our ability to use plants or animals by taking them in our hands, but to understand them like our ancestors did, as part of a complex phenomena that we have the ability to affect or be affected by. For example, to burn a plant is said to release its soul, and each plant has a unique soul or imprint on our bodies when we breathe it, ingest it, or apply it, sending our body very specific messages. To talk with animals or observe them like our ancestors did and our elders still do today allows an understanding of the skills and gifts that they have to teach us about ourselves and the world. To heat certain rocks increases its internal magnetism, which interacts with special receptors in our bodies that allows grounding and a reorganization of mineral-rich tissues, such as done in many ceremonial practices. By connecting back to these natural elements, our reality becomes one of peace, understanding, and purpose. We come to know an ancestral safe haven regardless of the endless ups and downs in life. Even those cancer cells come from cells that deregulate themselves, recapitulating successfully earlier ancestral lifestyles. So if cancer is trying to go back to a primordial ancestral state, maybe it's trying to teach us something. If the body has purpose in health, wouldn't it also have a purpose in disease? Herophilus stated, when health is absent, wisdom cannot reveal itself, art cannot manifest, strength cannot fight, wealth becomes useless, and intelligence cannot be applied. Chief Dan George said, allow me to learn the ways of your book knowledge so that I may combine it with my natural knowledge and lead the way. A bridging of traditional knowledge with modern knowledge is the only way forward sustainably for our people. When people have a true understanding of self and the universe, they become one and the same, and through this they achieve peace. This peace can then translate to meaning, focus, purpose, and the ability to use this short physical life as a hologram to others to allow them to achieve the same. Without access to the lands and waters for the purposes of reestablishing our interconnections, we will constantly feel like we have something unfulfilled. Pretending to be a rabbit when you are not only leads you down the wrong trail. By deciding to work towards an understanding of the vibrational force, which is the universe, we all make a decision to live more than we have ever done. This is not esoteric. It's Indigenous science as its purest and rawest form. Or as my sister said, we are not New Age, we are Native. Remember that land as a medicine place provides a space where we can play our drums to remind us of the vibrational force that creates all living beings and that the whole world really is inside of us as it is outside. So with this, I want to say Masi Cho. We are in turbulent times, depending on the way that folks look at the world. In essence, we always have a place, which is the land base that surround us as a regrounding unit, particularly as providers, as clinicians, as helpers. One of the most fundamental aspects of our teaching is the importance of taking ourselves as first for healing, because we can only take patients as much as we take ourselves. Keeping ourselves grounded is fundamental in our communities, and many of our traditional healers have specific protocols in place to ensure that regrounding on a regular basis, ensuring that we're in line with the earth, with the land, so that we can bring that energy to our patients as we work with them. So I know we're getting close to the end of the time here based on questions, but you know, I think the approach for many of our communities is we often get focused, as noted, on the protocols, the practices, the medicines themselves, and forgetting about that regrounding to ourselves and what's around us, getting caught up in the busyness of the world. And if we get caught up in the busyness of the world, we're not going to be good to our patients for very long. Burnout is a real crisis within our populations, and the more we can take some of these wisdoms and pieces of elements that our traditional healers have used for generations, those traditional healers today who have already been through genocide, have already been through cultural upheaval, who have been through, you know, some of the biggest traumas are the ones that I still see ground themselves, laugh, ensure that they're eating well and fed well. So Masi Cho, Masi means thank you in my community. Cho is like big, but really one of the elders from my region said that Cho is actually an honor word. So if you go to my area, you'll hear the lake Tucho. Yes, it's a big lake, but it's an honor lake. Decho is the river. It's yes, it's a big river, but it's an honor river. So Masi Cho is a thank you, but it's also an honor thank you. So Masi.
Masi Cho, thank you so much, Dr. Redvers. I have to say, you have this incredible ability of making the seemingly invisible visible to us, through the storytelling and sharing, reconnecting us back to our elements. And I just really, really appreciated this breath of fresh air, in your presentation. And I guess my first question is, how do we attune our conventional medical systems based on our positionality? We're just talking about one here, but how do we attune that back into this rhythm? How do we communicate to the C-suite or CEOs this importance?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And, in the last 5 years, we've seen a number of aligning issues, of course. Number one is the high rates of burnout of healthcare providers is on a skyrocketing level. And not only for physicians, obviously, but for nurses and for all other health professionals. This is a global phenomenon. This is not just exclusive to the United States, amplified by COVID. We, of course, see greater funding pressures, as costs rise, not only for institutions and otherwise. And then third, we see, a changing environment where many hospitals are now recognizing the importance of sustainability and environmental sustainability in that. So those kind of, three pillars are really starting to change the conversation of what we're seeing within the medical environment, where there is a leverage of opportunity to be able to intervene in a strategic way when we are thinking about what this actually means in terms of a renewed transformation. Because transformation, it's always thrown out there. What does that mean? It's so opaque. There's no kind of tangible realities to that. And it makes it even more difficult when things are going relatively well, but it makes it a little easier when there is crisis going on to be able to say, we need a new approach here. This is not working. How do we actually make a business case for ensuring providers are well and ensuring patients are well, while still, of course, particularly in the US context, ensuring that costs are managed. And we are seeing increasing studies now coming out. And the environmental angle for me has provided very helpful, because a lot of the environmental sustainability initiatives, number one, save money. They bring in the sense of the environment through a little bit more of a strategic way that can then realign back to patients, whether or not it is through more conventional kinds of approaches of switching the medications that we're using from things like, the MDI inhalers to the dry powder inhalers, due to, of course, the substantial increases on greenhouse gas emissions. And then the nature prescribing movements, which have taken fold. Here in Canada now, physicians can prescribe, and I know they can in some states as well in the United States, a pass to a essentially equivalent of a state park, where they can go as part of that prescription, these social prescriptions of getting out, knowing that the benefits on there. So we're starting to see this system approach aligning. How do we take these factors now and mold them together a little bit into a systems-based approach, where it's not just, okay, can we create holistic medicine? Well, no, it's actually, how do we actually think about this integrated throughout the system? And I don't think we've been very good at that as a community so far. We've been driving a couple highways very clearly and not getting much success, but taking the broader perspective now and finding those entry points in some of these other ways, I think will allow for a more facilitated conversation, because it's not going to change overnight. How do we find those openings to start to get the conversation going, so that, again, we start to create that slow leverage movement and the tipping points that allow the change to happen?
Yeah, it sounds like it's actually kind of finding that shared language, or as you mentioned, shared decision making. These are all constituting a kind of taxonomy that has become more and more digestible and acceptable, in the medical system as we kind of foresee it. So, yes, thank
Absolutely. Yeah, those, it's that's not a surprise anymore. The data speaks very clearly on shared decision making and what that means, not only the reduction of medical errors, but also, patient preference and satisfaction with the care that they're given. And those are entry points that can start to be used in these kinds of conversations.
And I appreciate you mentioning like self-care, which is very egocentric, but it's part of all of us as a language that kind of helps with that sense of burnout, the nature prescriptions as a way of relationship to kind of that larger whole, and then kind of planetary medicine is another term that has been used, and I'd be curious about your perspective on that as well.
Yeah. And I would sort of shift, I think, this idea has been pervasive where, this approach of taking our care of ourselves is this ego sort of, individualistic approach. But from our community, we would actually see that as an ego approach because we are in and of itself nature. So if we are taking care of ourselves, we're taking care of nature as a part of that. So redesigning what that means in terms of our collective responsibility of ensuring we have healthy bodies, we're making healthy choices around us, facilitates an environment around us that. So I would sort of reclassify that as an eco approach and necessary for us to be part of that ecosystem, that collective knowing that is integral. And you'll hear elders say time and time and time again that if we don't take care of ourselves, we're no good to anybody. That is not an ego approach because we are a provider. We have a responsibility to take care of a community. So it's actually an investment in that holistic ability to ensure that we're better care providers to our people. The planetary health approach, is increasing, and obviously there's a lot of political sensitivities around things like climate change, but planetary health is much broader than that. It takes into account the pollution, the pesticides, the plastics, the biodiversity components, the climate as well as there today. So, this planetary health approach, particularly that's been advanced by the Planetary Health Alliance, now based out of Johns Hopkins, who has a clinical network for providers to be able to connect on these issues, discuss. They have course trainings with that. There's a lot of bridging now compared to 10 years ago within the field of the emotional, mental components and the spiritual dynamics that come into that. And really looking at it as a holistic element is really a key opportunity and leverage point. In fact, they've now got buy-in from UNEP as well as the WHO as part of this process. So another leverage point for change, I think, that we can start to think about, because just because we're providing integrative care, just because we're providing naturopathic care, functional medicine, whatever it is, doesn't mean that we can't turn away from our responsibility. We often cite that we're more nature-based, but really, if you look at the way that our practices are, we're not really that much more nature-based. There's very few people that are thinking about their carbon footprint impact, the amount of plastics that we're using in our bottles or machineries. So we have just as much of an equal responsibility, I think, utilizing the supports of all of the existing resources that are out there. It's not something we have to carry on our shoulders. It's a collective responsibility. There's a lot of work that's been done around this to make sure that it's easy for us to take the steps that we need to, again, bring ourselves into that eco community and thinking about planetary health in the context of patients, but also the community as well.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to select one of them. So there's a lot of gratitude, first of all, and saying that your work is a gift and so important. One of the questions asks, could you speak to the power of indigenous ways of being and knowing, especially healing in the context of the fall of an empire? Community feels even more critical than ever these days.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen an exploding increase in the interest on Indigenous knowledges. And I first always clarify that it's important to note that Indigenous knowledges don't come without Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples have been through falls of many empires, throughout the years. And there's a lot of resilience that comes from our communities when you have been forced into genocide, land displacement, cultural assimilation, all of these things. So, our Indigenous communities are a symbol of resilience within our countries of having been through site trauma, but remaining and keeping cultural practices intact. So, due to that, the resilience elements, and there's been quite a bit of papers written on this in terms of community, the intergenerational love that perpetuates in balance with the intergenerational traumas of all the events, whether political or otherwise, in my mind, is going to be a solid stone that will remain regardless of the crises that we have. It doesn't mean that there's external pressures or things that are not going to put stress on that, but our communities are steadfast in this ability to ensure the self-determination of their peoples. So, what drives that? What are the characteristics that allow for those kinds of resilient pieces? one of them comes back to those four items that I talked about before, which is responsibility, driven by a large sense of responsibility to self, community, and the land, for and foremost. We are born as stewards. And many of our worldviews say that our purpose on planet here is to steward and be responsible for the things that we're curated or for the period that we're here. And then we go back and perhaps we come back again. But that is our role and responsibility of people. It's not to sit back and, to enjoy life per se in the way that, we might see in the media or social media, but really is a sole responsibility, maintaining respect with ourselves and others, these sort of value-driven approaches that no matter the things that happen in the world, these are our fundamental basis. And we've lost that as a society. If you ask many kids today or teenager, what are our values as a society? It's hard for them to answer that question because we've kind of lost our way a little bit. We're all over the place. And it doesn't mean that we all have to have the same values. We just have to have values and understand where we are in a responsibility and how we can engender that, I think, in our young people coming up. Gives them a sense of hope, but purpose and grounding. It's one of the reasons why I think we have so much anxiety and depression right now, not only in youth and teenagers and adults, but we don't have a foundation in society to be able to root them to. That this is your role, this is your responsibility, this is the gift that you've been given, and your obligation is to ensure that the gifts that you have are given away. And there's purpose and meaning that comes in that. When elders, for example, tell young people that we see this gift in you, this is where you're going to shine in the world, and support and honor those gifts as that person gets older, so they can participate as good members in society as we move forward in their life and as collective members of our communities.
I have to say, I really appreciate that perspective on how to kind of be the glue to all these fragmentations of self and kind of thinking about our kids these days and how they may not feel like a sense of belonging as well, and with the trauma of the world too. So thank you very much. And another question we have here is there a specific meditation practice which you prescribe?
Yeah, I love to turn people. There's a Mayan Indigenous woman who was at Berkeley, although with all the funding cuts, unfortunately, was one of those Indigenous recipients, is Yuria Seldowin. She did a whole PhD around Indigenous contemplative practice and mindfulness. It has a book on it and also a number of wonderful meditations. And I really love to have folks refer to some of her meditations that are out there because they're Indigenous focused in terms of their alignment with our worldviews, despite, of course, her being Mayan. I'm in a very different place, but they're all also very land-based in their conceptions with it. So I encourage folks to check out Yuria Seldowin's work. Particularly around this area, because she's very grounding, and I think does a really good job of bringing in all communities that are not just Indigenous, but really making it applicable and accessible to all communities without limits.
Thank you. And one more question here by Bonnie Weaver. Do you have a sense of how someone who is not an ND can make progress with the goals you suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our elders always say we never stop learning. The day you stop learning or think we know everything is the day that our life is over in some senses. And there's many opportunities, I think, out there for people to participate, whether or not it's in professional development activities. But ultimately, I think, our elders, one of the most profound ceremonies that we have is going out on the land on our own. And it's, traditionally the Western sort of way talked about it as vision quests or things, which is not really a term that we use. But the entire purpose behind it is being able to sit with oneself for a period of time on your own, out in the land. That's usually 4 days and 4 nights. And, the experience that comes with that, you have to get faced with yourself. Number one, your thoughts, because there's no phones allowed, there's no connectivity, anything. It's just you and yourself and I for 4 days and 4 nights, on a land based. And there was purpose in why our communities did that, because in facing yourself, you have to overcome a lot of things because it's not easy. Most of the time when we do it without food and water, although I don't recommend people do that right away without elder supervision, of course. So, not only are you hungry and thirsty, but, you're out on your own with the elements. And these kinds of practices, minus the food and, not including and making sure you eat and have water, but just being out there on the land provides this wave of perspective that you have to go through sitting with yourself for 4 days. And those kinds of practices I think are very much minimized in our society today because we're so busy, there's always technology and things. And it's hard when people haven't done that. A lot of people find that very difficult. After the first day, they're like, give me something to do. But you have to kind of work through that. And, in my mind, it's one of the most profound things because you're forced to settle your energy in some ways. And when you're forced to settle your energy, insights start to come forward that you never thought possible. Connectivity pieces start to come. And that's the beauty of the land being a partner in the healing process. So, in addition to the professional development, sort of Euro-Western kind of training, accessibilities in my mind, that land-based approach really is something that is profound. It's not easy. It's hard for a lot of people in modern day society, but in my mind, it can reap many, many benefits to people when they put in the purposeful intent to be able to settle one mind and sit with land for a while to see what comes to oneself, because it does bring out some of the things that are of challenge within one's life.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I think of when you said capital L, I think of like Carl Jung, and he had like the small s and the capital S, but that helps us, those kind of 4 day journeys, I think helps us connect to our little L and the bigger L, Mother Earth. So thank you very much. And another question here is, what is an example of an Indigenous viewpoint of climate change?
Yeah, so Indigenous communities, I've been hearing about climate change for 20 years because being from the subarctic region, we've been warming at 3 to 4 times the global rate. And in fact, we're some of the first, our elders were some of the first to put the white flag out, despite scientists unfortunately not believing them at that time that things were changing, because of, there's a lot of discrimination that sometimes happens, particularly 20 years ago around that. But our elders were very persistent in terms of recognizing the change. They had many stories back. I heard my elders were told stories from their parents, back in the 60s and 70s of a time when they would start to see the ground falling in of themselves. And now in my region, we're seeing lakes collapse because of the permafrost instability, and literally from one day to the next, lakes are crossing. They told of a time when the sickness would start waking up from the ground. And now, because of the permafrost melt in our region, we're starting to see long frozen bacteria. There was a case of anthrax that killed a family in Siberia recently because of climate change melt. And we were also told stories of a time when the axis of the Earth would shift slightly. And now NASA's confirmed a shift in the Earth due to the melt of the polar caps, causing a weight distribution change, as well as the amount of fresh water that's being withdrawn from water reserves, changing that shift in the Earth. So these stories are things that our elders have talked about. That were going to happen within our regions. So the change was predicted, and it was not based on the fact that Earth would just change due to Earth. It was predicted based on the fact of the behaviors that they saw humans start to do. And they recognized that the behaviors that humans were starting to do were counter to the sustainability needs of the planet, and that humans would start to put things out of balance. So, these predictions were not based on Earth. They were based on watching patterns of human behavior and our fall away from our alignment with Earth-centered living that were needed to keep everything in balance. So, climate change is a result of the kinds of and the format of society that we've run, which of course, is very complex and, could have hours to speak about these things. But there is a very clear understanding of the cause of climate change and what needs to be done to be able to reverse it.
Thank you. And I also want to highlight that wisdom of elders continuously coming through, and that you also mentioning that elders, our planet has gone through these kinds of rises and falls and separations in our societies, and remembering our kind of collective responsibility. I think we have one more question we can probably take in, and this is from Catherine Herbin, who is one of our East Asian medicine practitioners. And so she considers herself an Indigenous medicine lineage holder. And she's wondering if these ancient healing modalities could work together as well.
Yeah, so one of the recent advancements, of course, is the World Health Organization has recently launched the new global indigenous, or sorry, the global traditional medicine strategy coming forward. They just had their second gathering in New Delhi, India, back in December that I was attending. Maybe some other folks were there too. This is the second of two, and really, there's been a shift in the interest in being able to look at what varied traditional medicine systems are doing. So what we often see, of course, is traditional medicine practices, and I want to be very clear that Indigenous traditional medicine practices are very different from recognized Indigenous peoples. So we got to be careful about that because there's geopolitical considerations in separating peoples from their practices. Different people can have practices, but Indigenous peoples is a different construct. But ultimately, what we've seen as a part of those discussions, because there has been an Indigenous people's group, so to speak, facilitating and bringing in streams of conversation into that larger traditional medicine work that the WHO is leading, that of course includes many different kinds of practices that would be considered indigenous to various areas of the world, is that number one, everybody seems to be very aligned with the intent that we need better options. We need more conversations around holistic care can be integrated as a first line service, given the fact that the majority of the world's population, particularly in the global south, this is the first line of treatment, is often traditional medicine. The second thing is we need to make sure that equity and rights are platformed within those conversations, because otherwise it risks appropriation or extraction of practices or knowledges without benefit to those peoples where the knowledge is originated. And that is a key concern for many Indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of interest in being able to think about bridging and partnerships. But right now, a lot of the structures don't protect the intellectual property rights or set out benefit sharing agreements for Indigenous peoples to ensure that if they do share their knowledge, that it's not going to be taken away, extracted for profit without, again, benefit back to the community. So right now, the conversation is, well, how do we build up these structures first to ensure that there's parameters in place that when bridging or partnership wants to occur, that it's done in a safe way, it's not done in an extractive way, and it's done in a way that's going to benefit all people. So is the potential there? Absolutely. Are we there yet? Probably not quite, because these structures haven't advanced quite as far as we need to for the protection of Indigenous peoples.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, our elders, ancestors, the land, Dr. Redvers, and your talk really inspires me to think about how we can be convergent and divergent at the same time in the whole kind of system model. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a great day. Yeah, and
Thanks
remember
all.
the
Merci,
water
Joe.
around you. So thank you so much.